I want to thank everybody for attending this webinar with Dr. Tim Clark. Thanks again for coming. And I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Timothy R. Clark. Dr. Clark will be talking about his new book, The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety. Hi, Tim. Good morning.
Good morning, Jonathan. I'm
Okay,
doing great. Thanks for having me.
Okay, hey, no problem. Listen, what you discuss is incredibly important for all companies and all leadership everywhere to learn. And I think that your new book really nails it when it comes to the ability to create a productive and inclusive, innovative workforce, and of course that translates out to a highly productive company. And I'll let you take from here, and we're all looking forward to your talk.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Jonathan. And thanks everybody for joining us. And so let me just point your attention to your chat box. So please use your chat box and feel free to make comments or ask questions. And Jonathan will help monitor questions as they come in. If there's something that we want to try to answer. So please feel free. Let's try to make this as interactive as we can. As Jonathan said, we're going to talk about the 4 stages of psychological safety, which is a book that was just recently released a few weeks ago. And I want to just mention right at the beginning that we're going to do a giveaway. And so here's how the giveaway works. So after the webinar, for the first 10 attendees who post a comment about the webinar, tagging LeaderFactor and including the hashtag psychological safety, we will send you a digital copy of the book. So if you're interested, then stay with us and post right after, and we will be happy to send a code to you for a digital copy. Well, let's get into the topic. The topic is psychological safety. Most of you have probably heard of the topic, or you know something about it. Some of you may be diligent students of the topic. And so let me begin with a very basic definition of psychological safety. Psychological safety means that it's not expensive to be yourself in a social setting. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean emotionally, socially, politically, economically, it's not expensive. And when it's not expensive, what do? We are comfortable being ourselves. It's easy to be ourselves. We engage so that we love those terms of engagement. If it is expensive, then what do? We're not ourselves. And so what the research literature has shown here over several years, the primary research finding is that fear in organizations changes people's behavior. Now, let me trace a little history for you. Psychological safety as a concept came into the research in 1965. The earliest research citation for the concept of psychological safety was by a couple of scholars at MIT, Edgar Schein and Warren Bennis. And they wrote a book on personal and organizational change. And they put just a little paragraph on the topic of psychological safety. So it goes all the way back to 1965. But the concept is not new. The concept is as old as the first human interaction. But since 1965, the research has been building slowly on this topic. In the last couple of years in particular, it's exploded. We now have a lot of empirical data that supports the premise here that fear changes behavior. But we didn't understand the extent to which this was true. We're finally just starting to comprehend how profound the implications are. So let me show you how this works with a little bit of a visual. Every human has what we call a self-censoring instinct. At some point in an organization, you have a culture in an organization, and that culture has either some level of psychological safety at one end of the spectrum, or if you go to the other end of the spectrum, as you can see on the slide, we move into the territory of fear. At some point, if leaders are pushing the fear button, that fear activates the pain centers of the brain and triggers what we call the self-censoring instinct. And every human has a self-censoring instinct. And so what do? If that self-censoring instinct is activated, we retreat into a mode of personal risk management, pain avoidance, and self-preservation. And so the biggest obstacle to inclusion and innovation is the culture. Now we like to repeat the quote from Peter Drucker, right? That culture eats strategy for breakfast. Well, culture eats innovation for lunch and dinner. It is the single biggest obstacle to innovation in any organization. We are now starting to understand how that works. What is the mechanism that blocks innovation, that blocks engagement, that blocks the creative capacity of the organization? It's the lack of psychological safety. If we're triggering that self-censoring instinct, then we are siphoning off productive capacity and we're just wasting it. That's what's happening. Okay, so in this webinar, I want you to take the opportunity to crack yourselves open and take a look inside and do a little self-examination, a little self-inventory to see how you're doing and whether you are fostering and cultivating psychological safety in your respective organizations. So let me begin by sharing some questions, and I want you to reflect on this, okay? Here's some questions. Number one, have you ever felt excluded in a social setting? Have you ever been afraid to ask a question? Have you ever remained silent when you knew the answer to a problem? Have you ever had someone steal credit for something you did? Have you ever been ignored in a discussion? Have you ever been rudely interrupted in a meeting? Have you ever felt that you were the target of a negative stereotype? Have you ever faced retaliation for challenging the status quo? Have you ever had a boss who asked for feedback but didn't really want it? Have you ever been publicly shamed or made fun of? Have you ever been punished for making an honest mistake? And finally, have you ever been made to feel, let me get that right. Have you ever been made to feel inferior? These are common everyday experiences that people have that trigger the self-censoring instinct and push them into a mode of self-preservation and risk management. So with that, I want you to reflect on that, because chances are your hand's in the air and you can say, oh yeah, that happened to me. It's happened to all of us. But what I'd like you to do is to reflect on your own behavior and your own patterns and ask yourself, am I doing any of these things to trigger the self-censoring instinct in the people with whom I work and the people with whom I associate? That's the question that we need to ponder today. So here's the agenda for today. We want to talk about how the human family behaves. And we've just given a lot of examples, unfortunately, of patterns that we see in organizations that trigger the self-censoring instinct. So welcome to the human family. We're all part of that family. We're going to talk about the 4 stages of psychological safety and what the progression looks like empirically, how we move from stage to stage. And finally, we're going to talk about increasing psychological safety. How do we do that? Because that is an imperative. It's a moral imperative, and it's a strategic imperative for every leader in every organization. Now, here's what we know. Fear-stricken employees, they give you their hands. They'll give you their hands. They'll give you some of their head, but they will give you none of their heart. And that's the problem. It's also the opportunity. For organizations that are able to cultivate high levels of psychological safety, you're going to get hands, you're going to get head, and you're going to get heart. For organizations that don't, you are handicapped. You are at a significant disadvantage to your competitors because of this fact. If fear is prevalent in the organization, that is the first sign of weak leadership. What that means is that leaders are abdicating their leadership role. They're pushing the fear button, which means that they're not leading anymore. And that's something that we have to overcome in many organizations. Now, what are the consequences, and I should say unintended consequences of low psychological safety? This is what we're finally starting to figure out. We're starting to figure out the full breadth and depth of the tax that we impose on our organizations when psychological safety is low, when fear is high. Now, let me just show you some here. Now, this is based on a 12-year study coming out of Harvard University. And I won't slog through all of the data points, but just take a look at a couple because the costs are enormous. For example, take a look at bullet number 1. 48% of employees intentionally decrease their work effort if psychological safety is low and fear is high. Go all the way down to the last bullet. 25% of employees admit to taking their frustrations out on customers. That's the price we pay when psychological safety is low. It's incredible. So, as I said, the research literature is now starting to understand the full list of unintended consequences, the burden that we bear if psychological safety is not high in the organization. What it comes down to is whether on your team or in your organization, vulnerability is rewarded or punished. And these are the patterns that you need to pay attention to. So the next time you're in a meeting, I want you to be a dual monitor. And I want you to monitor content, what is being said, but I also want you to monitor interpersonal dynamics. What is going on non-verbally and emotionally and socially and politically in the room? When there's an act of vulnerability in the room, for example, someone makes a suggestion, someone asks a question, right? These are acts of vulnerability. Someone states a point of view that may not be consistent with the prevailing point of view. That's an act of vulnerability. Pay attention to acts of vulnerability. Are they being rewarded or punished? When vulnerability is punished, social interaction becomes expensive. And so it changes. People retreat, they recoil, they curl up. That's what happens. So we have names for these. Where psychological safety is high, where acts of vulnerability are rewarded, we call this a blue zone. Okay, so let me just ask you, and use your chat box for those of you that are with us today. So we've got a lot of you. What else, when you are in a blue zone, when that vulnerability is being rewarded, what do people tend to do? What else do people tend to do? Put it in your chat box and let's see if we can get some comments here. So how do people behave in what we call a blue zone? Go ahead and okay, fantastic. They open up, they relax, they think creatively, they talk to others. The velocity of information increases. The productive output goes up. The feedback goes up. right? Okay, fantastic. Belongingness increases. The cross-training, cross-pollination increases. Okay, fantastic, right? So what we're trying to do is we're trying to reduce the expense of social interaction. These are great. The culture becomes more cohesive. There's a higher tolerance for candor. Do you see the implications? Do you see the consequences? Okay, now let's go to the other side and let's just flesh this out a little bit. If you're in a red zone, psychological safety is low. Vulnerability is being punished. What are the behavioral consequences? Hit your chat box. Let's take a look. Okay, silence. People withdraw. People shut down. People engage in avoidance. There's more anxiety. I'm just reading your list here. They give you the bare minimum. They hoard information. They sabotage. Fantastic. Productivity goes down. Innovation goes down. Okay. This is so good. The meetings aren't the real meetings anymore, right? The meetings become a charade, and you have the real meeting after the meeting. Okay, and this is fantastic. So Ross just said, eventually it starts to impact mental health. It's absolutely true. What did we say? If fear triggers the self-censoring instinct, it's also activating the pain centers of the brain. So the ramifications are profound. All right, now let's dig a little deeper. By the way, your comments are brilliant. Let's dig a little deeper into the construct of psychological safety. Now, I said at the outset that it means it's not expensive to be yourself, but let's go deeper because there's a lot of depth to the construct of psychological safety. Here's what we've seen in the empirical research. Psychological safety means that you can do four things. Number one, you can feel included in the social unit. Number two, you feel safe to learn. Number three, you feel safe to contribute. And finally, you feel safe to challenge the status quo. And you can do all of these things without fear of being marginalized or humiliated or punished in some way. So now we're going to deconstruct the mechanism and the stages of psychological safety. So let me go a little further and let's put this on a graph. So psychological safety is a function of two things. Number one, respect. So you'll see respect on the vertical axis. And number two, permission. You see permission on the horizontal axis, right? So it's the intersection of these two things. Now, here's how the progression works. Number one, so stage one is inclusion safety. You have to feel included. This is the foundation. And then we move to learner safety. And I'm going to get into each of these in a little bit more depth. After learner safety comes contributor safety, where we are working together, we're collaborating, we're engaged in the value creation process together. And then finally, the culminating stage is challenger safety, where we feel confident enough, safe enough to actually challenge the status quo. And that is the ultimate level of psychological safety. Okay, now let me show this to you in even a little bit more detail without getting too busy. Now, this is the same graph, but it's portrayed a little bit differently. But let me just add a couple of things. So before we get to stage one, which is inclusion safety, we have a state of exclusion. We have to cross a threshold to get to stage one, which is inclusion safety. Before that, we are in a state of exclusion. Some people feel this way on their teams. This means that we don't even have the foundation of psychological safety in place. And this is, you're in a deficit position and you're in a very high risk position. as far as engagement, as far as productivity, as far as retention, right? And many other things. So then we move through our progression. Now, let me just show you a couple of things that are quite interesting. I want you to think about the stages of psychological safety as a bowling lane. If you go out of bounds, right? If you leave the lane and you hit the gutter on either the left or the right, you're in a bad place. So to the left, upper left, is what we call paternalism. Paternalism means that respect is high, but permission is low. So this is where we coddle people. This is where we pat them on the heads and say, don't touch anything. That's the benevolent paternalism that still exists in many organizations. Now, if you go to the lower right, it says exploitation. Exploitation is a combination of high permission. In other words, we want you to contribute, we want you to create value, but respect is low. So we're exploiting you. We want to extract from you all of the value that you can create, but we don't respect you inherently. So you can see the two gutters of the bowling lane. We want to avoid those extremes because they both become very dangerous. All right, now let's go into a little bit more depth. Stage one, inclusion safety. Why do we start with inclusion safety? Because this is the first level of basic human need. If you go into a new social setting, and if you watch other people, say it's at work, school, home, civic organization, team, it doesn't matter. What is the first thing that people want? They want to be included. They want to belong. They want to be accepted. So inclusion safety satisfies the basic human need to be included. That's why we start there, because that's where humans start. So we can't skip this stage. We can't plow around it. This is the foundation. And as we all know, we struggle in many social units to just provide inclusion safety. Now, why do we struggle? Why do we have diversity and inclusion departments in every multinational organization upon the face of the earth now? Because we're struggling with this. We're still struggling with this. Let me give you an example of why we struggle. I have a very old Chevy Suburban with 319,000 miles on the odometer. It has a resale value of about $375. Not too long ago, I went to have my old car, this rust bucket, serviced. And when I went to take my car in, I was not treated very well. And I could tell that I was not treated very well based on the car in which I was driving. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? And then I went back in my black sedan not long after to have it serviced. And guess what? People treated me differently based on the vehicle that I was driving. Now, is that unusual? Unfortunately, it's not unusual. So people's behavior changed based on a status, an indication or an artifact of status. This is how humans behave. So let me dig into this a little bit more. We tend to govern ourselves based on junk theories of superiority. And I go into this in chapter 2 of the book. So what we're constantly looking for is some basis on which to justify our superiority. And when we come up with a junk theory or a soothing story of superiority, we try to elevate ourselves and subordinate others. That creates difference. And then we have a myth of superiority. So these myths are based on things like social and cultural status. It could be political or ideological. It could be intellectual. I'm smarter than you. It could be physical appearance. I'm better looking than you. I'm a better athlete than you. It could be economics. I have more money than you. It could be ethnic or racial. It could be gender-based superiority. It could be moral or religious-based superiority. Here's the bottom line. These are all myths of superiority. These are soothing stories that we tell ourselves. They're junk theories. They're all false. And so that's why in the book, we have to get this concept very, very clear. Worth precedes worthiness. Human beings are inherently worthy. So if you're human and you're harmless, I have a moral obligation to invite you into my society. There is no justification. There's no rationale on which I can exclude you except the threat of harm. But barring that, I have a moral obligation to include you. Worth precedes worthiness. We're talking about worth. This is something that we still struggle with mightily in organizations and social units of all kinds. And so this is the moral force that's acting on organizations is now bigger than ever. Now, why is this a big deal? Well, think about the millennials that are flooding into the workforce. They're flooding into the workforce and they're looking around and they're saying, hey, boomer, why is it that you have normalized harassment or public shaming behavior? Why is it that you have normalized bullying behavior? Why is it that you have normalized manipulation? Why is it that you have normalized some coercive tendencies? So not long ago, I went to a new client and I interviewed the executive team. And it was very clear to me right off the bat that the CEO had iced them into a mode of silence. Their self-censoring instinct had been triggered. And this is the way they did business. And I said, well, why is it that you put up with this bullying behavior from the CEO? And they said, well, it's okay. It's just normal around here. We've learned to kind of deal with it, kind of put up with it. Do you see what's happened? In organization after organization, we have normalized unacceptable, intolerable behavior. The moral force that is acting upon organizations today is becoming even bigger. And this is a wonderful thing because we are finally taking self-inventory. We're taking an unsparing, unedited view of what we have been doing since the Industrial Revolution. And we're saying, hey, this is not okay. And in the organizations that are accelerating, here's what we're seeing. They are actually incorporating psychological safety as a selection criterion for advancement to management. So what does that mean? That means that if you don't have a demonstrated track record of creating and sustaining psychological safety with your colleagues, you are ineligible to become a manager. You are disqualified until you can demonstrate a track record of doing that. This is what we are starting to see in the most progressive companies. And this is a wonderful thing because inclusion safety is the foundation. Okay. Questions or comments? Okay. So I want you to think about now, why is inclusion safety? I'm just going to ask this one more time. Why do we struggle with just the foundation? Let me offer one more suggestion. Because the human race universally suffers from insecurity. And therefore, we continue to create differences and junk theories of superiority because of our own insecurities. That is why leadership in this new decade requires a moral capacity to be comfortable in your own skin and to not have to keep telling the world how smart you are, how clever you are, and hiding behind title, position, and authority and the artifacts that the organization has given us, right? So I think we're making progress, and that's the good news. That's the good news. So how do you How do you increase inclusion safety? I have three basic recommendations for you. Number one, invite. The more you invite, the more inclusion safety that you're creating. Number two, ask. Ask sincerely, ask genuinely. Ask about the person, ask about background, ask about interests. So number two, ask. Number three, share. Share your point of view, share your background, share your opinions. Many of us have been deeply socialized to create and maintain professional distance. It completely flies in the face of all of the research that's coming out, particularly from the MIT Human Dynamics Lab. It is familiarity that creates more inclusion safety. So this professional distance, what does it do? It maintains relationships based on superficiality. Never going to work. You're never going to get there. You cannot do it. You can't sustain inclusion safety if you're abiding by that old industrial age concept. It doesn't work. So invite, ask, share. Okay, let's go to stage two. Now builds on stage one. Stage two is learner safety. Learner safety means that you feel free and able to engage in the learning process, the discovery process, without fear, again, or of retribution, without fear of ridicule, without fear of embarrassment. What does that mean? It means that I can ask questions. I can give and receive feedback. I can experiment. I can even make mistakes. And I feel safe in doing that. Now, what have we learned? What have cognitive psychologists learned? We've learned that the learning process itself is a combination of the intellectual and the emotional. Those two tracks are woven together. You cannot separate them. And so therefore, what great leaders, great teachers, great coaches, great parents do is they disconnect failure and mistakes from fear. They disconnect those because they are not necessarily associated with each other. Now, unfortunately, they are in many organizations, but there's not a necessary relationship between those two things. And for those of you that read the book, you'll read a case study about a high school calculus teacher, the most successful high school calculus teacher in America, and how he is able to disconnect fear from mistakes and failure. That's what leaders have to do in order to cultivate and maintain learner safety. So this is stage two. Let me give you kind of a sweet example of this. So back in 1918, Albert Camus, a French philosopher, he won the Nobel Prize in literature. And a few days after he won the Nobel Prize, he wrote a handwritten note to his elementary school teacher. And he said this, he said, without you, without the affectionate hand that you extended to the small, poor child that I was, without your teaching and example, none of this would have happened. What is he saying? He's saying that this teacher escorted him through the learning process and provided learner safety so that he could engage in that discovery process safely. And that's what we all need, because every human brings some inhibition and some anxiety to the learning process. Let me give you another statistic that will blow your mind. Every 26 seconds in the United States of America, a student, a high school student, drops out. Every 26 seconds. Is this because they don't have the mental bandwidth to do the work? The answer is no. Barring some legitimate learning disability, almost all of these students can do the work. The reason that they drop out is because, as I said, there's the intellectual side and there's the emotional side of learning. They are emotionally bruised. They are emotionally injured. They don't feel the love and the support and the nurturing that they need in the learning process. And so they finally give up and they say, I'm done. They throw in the towel. That's what happens. And that's a tragedy. Is it any different in a business organization? No, it's not. The learning process is the same. Learning will forever be intellectual and emotional, and it will forever need to be nurtured by the leader. Another example of this, and you can go back to the episode, is when Oprah's fourth grade teacher came on the show as a surprise. She didn't know it was going to happen. And Oprah just went to tears and then later explained why she was so emotional, because this teacher was the one that nurtured her with learner safety, that built her confidence, and that allowed her to accelerate and develop her potential as never before. That's what leaders do. They nurture that. So here's some suggestions. How do you do it? Separate mistakes from fear. Ask for help. You personally need to model the behavior of asking for help. And your people need to see you do that, because in asking for help, you're modeling an act of vulnerability. They need to see acts of vulnerability modeled in front of them so that they can do the same. And then number 3, invite everyone to teach. It's one thing to learn, but if you're inviting others to teach, now you really are asking them to accelerate their learning. So if you can ask them to teach and invite them to teach, you're going to take learner safety to a completely different level. Okay? So that's learner safety. I wish we had more time to go into it. Let's go to stage 3. Stage 3, the third stage of psychological safety, is contributor safety. Contributor safety means that you are now able to contribute as a full-fledged member of the team, using all of your skills, knowledge, ability, talent, and collaborate in the value creating process. Now, why is this stage 3? Well, again, it's a very natural sequence. After we learn things as human beings, what's the instinct? What's the natural desire? The natural desire is to learn and apply what we have learned, or to apply and use what we have learned. So it's the next natural level of human need. So to satisfy that basic human need, we want to take what we've learned and we want to go apply it. We want to use it. We want to make a difference. Humans have a deep-seated need to make a difference. So what then does the leader do? The leader provides direction, encouragement, guidance, autonomy, and allows this to happen. Contributor safety is where we are now engaged in the value creation process. Okay, a little bit about how. So this is what you can do. Explain the how we do things to others. Delegate the why. And then we've got to go deeper as leaders. As we are cultivating contributor safety in others, we have to help them find that deep why for themselves that motivates them, right? They have to gain that for themselves. If we put them on a short leash and we try to micromanage them, we simply are gaining no leverage, and we are not releasing the creative and the productive output that people have. So recognize, as soon as people learn, they want to go use and apply and contribute. They have a deep need to be able to contribute. Okay, we've got to move quickly because we don't have a lot of time. Let's move to stage 4. Stage 4 is challenger safety. Stage 4 is the culminating stage. It's the ultimate stage. It's the final stage. It is the highest level of psychological safety. Now, why is that? Because challenger safety means that you feel safe in challenging the status quo. You are now at the highest level of personal risk and vulnerability. Therefore, you need the highest level of psychological safety to protect you in that behavior. So here's the social exchange. Here's the social exchange with challenger safety. You as the leader, you need to give me air cover in exchange for me giving you candor. That's the social exchange. I need air cover in exchange for candor. Now, why do we need this? Because challenger safety is the stage at which we do most of our innovation. Innovation by its very nature is disruptive of the status quo. It relies, so think about it. How do we solve problems? How do we come up with solutions? How do we innovate? We need creative abrasion. We need constructive dissent. We need hard-hitting dialogue. We cannot let title, position, authority, rank get in the way of a merit-based discussion. We're going to discuss issues on their merits. We can't, all of those things, those are artificial constraints. So if we truly want to innovate in the organization, we need to give people a license to innovate. And that license to innovate is that level of psychological safety, challenger safety. If they don't feel safe in challenging the status quo, then they're not going to do it because they're risking their personal standing and reputation. Who's going to do that, right? Okay. Now, let me ask you a question. Let's go to your chat box. On a scale from 1 to 10, and you can write in the number, 1 is low, 10 is high. How would you rate the level of challenger safety that you personally feel in your organization? Go ahead and put in a number. Let's see it. Okay. Okay. Okay, amazing. Now, we do empirical research on this. We have our 4 stages team survey, which we use across the world. And what we know is that the average for challenger safety is much, much lower because this is the ultimate test of leadership. So you're coming in with an average of about 5.5 right here. Now, some of you are showing a 10, which is incredible. The level of challenger safety that you have on a team is the ultimate bellwether for the overall health of that team. It is the most important vital sign that captures the essence of the culture. So if you have reported an 8 or a 9 or a 10 on that scale, you have a pretty healthy team. You're in a good place. And you are very fortunate to be working under those conditions. Most people are not that high, and you can see that we have a lot of work to do, right? So again, the key question is it safe to challenge the status quo? Is it safe to challenge the status quo? Now, if you can create a team culture, an organizational culture, or whatever your social unit is, and you can get all the way to psychological safety, what you're going to create is a pattern of behavior in your people. And the pattern of behavior is what we call intellectual bravery. Intellectual bravery, let me give you a definition for intellectual bravery. Intellectual bravery is a willingness to disagree, dissent, or challenge the status quo in a setting in which there is social, emotional, political, and economic risk. In spite of that risk, people are willing to come forward and they're willing to disagree or dissent or challenge the status quo. That's what intellectual bravery is. This is the most important behavioral pattern for creating an incubator of innovation in any organization. You can be exquisitely blessed with everything else in terms of raw intellectual horsepower, talent, resources, guidance, direction, strategy. If you don't have challenger safety to cultivate intellectual bravery, you are handicapped. You are not going to be able to do it, because this is the most important attribute. Now, let me see if I can frame this in a way that may be unique to you. I think this will make sense. So the leader's job is there are two kinds of friction interpersonally when we are working together in social units. There's intellectual friction and there's social friction. The leader's job is to simultaneously increase intellectual friction while decreasing social friction. This is the key mechanism that creates psychological safety to the level of challenger safety, level 4, stage 4, where people now feel willing to challenge the status quo. But this is what we need to understand. It's delicate and it's dynamic and it's never done. The job is never finished, right? There's a permanent impermanence to this, right? So I want you to think about this. Your job, again, is to increase intellectual friction and at the same time reduce social friction. Why is that? Because humans, at the end of every idea, suggestion, challenge, a point of view, is a human being, and we are very sensitive. And so if we allow the social friction to get too high, it will shut down the intellectual friction, and we will come to a stalemate. We will come to impasse. We will come to loggerheads, and we will not be able to progress in our collaboration. So that psychological safety becomes the lubricating oil for this collaboration to happen. But it's the leader's job to model this and to protect that intellectual friction. Okay. All right. Now here's a question that has come up that I want to from the chat box, and you guys are asking a lot of questions. So here's a great question. Do you think there is psychological safety? Let's see. Hang on a second. Yeah. So what are the implications given the pandemic and the fact that we've now moved to virtual? We've had this mass migration to virtual teams, working from home. What are the implications? The implications, and we could go on and on about this, and you can read my article from about 3 weeks ago in the Harvard Business Review about how to do this. But what it means is that we have to pay even more attention to nonverbal cues and body language, because we're not having a full sensory face-to-face experience. So that is number one. Number two, we have to dispense with the superficialities in the way that we're interacting. So, for example, if we're having a quick one-on-one, then you need to say, Tim, so how you doing today? And I'm going to say, I'm doing fine. How are you doing? And then you're going to say, no. How are you really doing? Tell me how it's going. That's what has to happen. We've got to go to another level of familiarity and another level of tolerance for candor in a virtual environment. Otherwise, we're losing people. They're disengaging, productivity's going south, and we're suffering. And so creating and maintaining psychological safety is an extra challenge in a virtual environment, but that is what we're faced with right now. It truly is. It's not easy, but that's what's happening. We're in that kind of environment. And we could go on and on about that. Okay, so let me just share a related point that we call the anatomy of culture. In any organization, there are levels of culture, as you know. The overall level of culture for an institution, the institutional culture, is what we call a macro culture. And in that macro culture, we have certain patterns or prevailing norms. If we go down from there, we have subcultures. Subcultures exist at the level of a business unit, a geography, a line of business, a functional area, right? We have subcultures, and they are materially different than the macro culture. They share some of the same attributes and some of the same patterns, but then there are differences. And then if we go down one more layer, we get to what's called the microculture. The microculture is the fundamental unit of culture, and it normally exists at the level of a team. The team is the basic unit of performance in this decade, in the 2020s. It's all about the team. So if you're concerned about culture, then what do? We attack culture by design and not by default. It is a designable asset, and we address it at all levels. But the most profound level is what level? The microculture. Because here's what we know, and we learned this years ago when I was doing my doctorate at Oxford. What we know is that this is what we call the culture formation hypothesis. The most important factor in the formation of culture is the modeling behavior of the leader, period, end. And so if we want to alter culture, we have to change the modeling behavior of the leader at the team level. Now, we can do some other things at the top, right? Top down, right? We can shift the norms as well. We can recast the prevailing norms. But the bottom-up effort to shift or change or alter the modeling behavior of frontline managers and team leaders cannot be ignored. Now, let me add a related point, and that is that the pandemic is providing us an incredible opportunity within the calamity. And here's the opportunity. A crisis does a beautiful thing. What a crisis does is it liquefies the status quo, and it does it almost suddenly. What takes us years when we try to do a cultural transformation in an organization, it takes sometimes years to do through incremental change. What a crisis can do is liquefy that status quo in a matter of days. And that's what COVID-19 has done. And so what it does is it presents to you and me this incredible opportunity to recast the prevailing norms of our organizations. And so the question for you and for me is, are you going to accelerate or hibernate during this crisis? Because you have an opportunity that will probably, hopefully, never come around again. It may be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to shift the culture and elevate the level of psychological safety on your teams and in your organization at large. So I want you to think about that. Okay, now I've gone on too long and I apologize, but there's a lot that I wanted to share with you, and we've only scratched the surface. So let's do a little bit of Q&A between now and the top of the hour. So go ahead and send in some questions, and let's just do some Q&A. So what questions do you have based on, and I know we've covered a lot of ground. We've covered psychological safety. We've covered the 4 stages. We've talked about the importance of elevating intellectual friction, reducing social friction.
Tim, I think we have some questions. If you scroll down,
Okay.
some people have some questions there.
Okay. How do you try to effect change when your immediate manager is the problem? This is an amazing, well, unfortunately, this is a very common problem. The first thing that you want to do is you need to realize that change, there's two kinds of change. Now, there's top-down change, and this is how enterprise-wide change most often takes place. But there's also what we call beachhead change, which means that it can start anywhere, and it can start to ripple through the organization. Number one, you need to worry about your own modeling behavior. Are you poised? Are you showing the poise and the composure and the superb emotional intelligence that you need to show in order to be a model? Because the primary enabling skill of psychological safety is emotional intelligence. There's a direct correlation between your emotional intelligence and the psychological safety on a team. So you've got to pay attention to that. That's how you increase your own influence skills. Your emotional intelligence is your conduit of influence to your manager as well as your coworkers. So you have to assess the extent to which you can be an influencer without positional power. You've got to assess that. And then you've got to try to do everything that you can based on your competency and your emotional intelligence to try to coach your boss. Now, I know that sounds ironic, but this is something that we all have to try to do in good faith, with absolute good faith. But you've got to try to do all that you can, because in doing that, you will create opportunities for yourself. Now, we could go on and on, but that's what I would do. I would start with yourself. The natural progression of leadership goes across three domains. Number one, lead yourself. Number two, lead the team. Number three, lead the business. You've got to focus on leading yourself in the best possible way. That's job one. Okay. Let's go to some others. Okay. Comment the traditional concept of team formation, storming, norming, and forming. Okay, this is the old Tuckman model that you're probably all familiar with. Yes. So let me comment on that. Here's what we're finding. That sequence and that process continues, and it's accurate. But what we're finding in 2020 and with the coming decade is that this process can happen much faster. So we go forming, storming, and norming. So the norming comes last, because what we're talking about is the definition and the establishment of the prevailing norms. What we're finding, and this is in large part due to the influence of millennials are coming into the workforce with a lot more native agility, and they are able to create, establish, and abide by norms much faster than the other generational cohorts. And so I guess what I'm saying is that you can do this much faster than perhaps you thought in the past. And this is a great benefit. This is one of the advantages that we have in the new decade, is that we can norm out a team. We can establish terms of engagement much, much faster. And that is really helping us. So I would just say that about it. I think that's an advantage that we have. There's more agility in the demographics. Okay. Let's see. I'm just scrolling through. There's a lot here. Here's a question. Do you like the concept of radical candor? Let me qualify that. So remember, I said that we need to increase intellectual friction and decrease social friction. Candor cannot include personal attacks. The moment that candor spills over into the personal realm, we're in trouble. And so leaders have to forbid personal attacks. If we need to provide candid feedback to a person about performance, that's fine. We don't do it in a public environment. We don't engage in public shaming. And we do it in a respectful way. And so I would simply qualify that, because sometimes people talk about radical candor and they don't know what they mean. So we have to be very careful about moving into the personal realm. That's where people often derail. So we have to be very careful about that. We want a high tolerance for candor, but we want to preserve the individual in the process. If we don't preserve the individual, then, as we talked about earlier, we trigger the self-censoring instinct and they retreat. Okay. So, Jonathan, I think we're out of time, unfortunately. And so we've got to wrap it up. But thank you so very much for the opportunity to spend a few minutes with you. And I will just say that, let me just share a couple of things for those of you that are interested in more resources.
Hey, Tim, I just wanted to add, if you want to keep going a little bit more, that's fine.
Okay. Well, for those of you that want to hang on, I'll just share, there's some free resources that I know some people will be interested in. First of all, there's the behavioral guide. The behavioral guide is a how-to, tactical, concrete behavioral guide that provides all of the behaviors for each of the 4 stages. And that is a free download. So if you just go to LeaderFactor.com, it's a free download. And it's a very robust resource to help leaders and teams. And then, of course, we have the 4 stages team survey. The first team is always free. And this is a very sophisticated survey platform that gives you survey data for each stage of psychological safety, as well as prescriptive analytics to help you figure out what the next steps are for you and your team. So those resources are available. And don't forget the free book giveaway for those of you that want to post. I'll answer some additional questions. We will excuse those of you that have to go at the top of the hour and say thanks very much for joining us. But I'd be happy to field some additional questions for those of you that would like to hang on. I'm happy to do that. Okay, let's see. How does growth mindset factor into psychological safety? So I think we're getting into the work of Carol Dweck at Stanford and mindset. So the growth mindset is basically a learning mindset. What psychological safety has to do with this is that we're now talking about the environment in which you are learning. And so if you have a learning mindset, that's fantastic, but you also need an environment that is going to nurture that. And so the leader stewardship, as far as promoting and cultivating a growth mindset, is to make sure that the learner safety is there, that we can ask the questions, that we can give and receive feedback, that we can experiment, that we can make mistakes, and we're not going to be punished for that. We're not going to be ridiculed. We're not going to be hung out to dry for that. So I would just simply encourage all of you to think about, am I doing my part, because I have a stewardship to play in cultivating a growth mindset with my people? To the extent possible, the workplace culture needs to support that. Okay. Okay, here's one. So let's talk about diversity and inclusion. First of all, let's distinguish the two. Diversity is a fact. It's a compositional fact. Even if you say you have a team that let's say we have a team that is not diverse in some areas. at a minimum, there's going to be cognitive diversity. So we always begin with cognitive diversity. That's the default position. It's true for every team. And then we move up from there to see what other kind of compositional diversity that we have. But we're going to set that aside because diversity is compositional. It's a fact. Inclusion is a choice. Inclusion is behavioral. The limitation that we have, the barrier that we have, and our efforts are not producing the return on investment for inclusion because we are obsessing on teaching awareness and appreciation of differences. That's fantastic. And I'm not suggesting that we stop doing that. We've got to continue to do that. But that is never going to be sufficient, because then what we're doing is we're aware of, we appreciate the differences, then we sit and wait for our hearts to change. That's not going to happen for most people. You're going to wait a long time if you're waiting for your heart to change. So how do you do it? Here's the principle. Behave until you believe. You can have appreciation and awareness of differences. Now you got to get to work. And what that means is that you start acting, interacting, collaborating, behaving with diverse people, with a diverse team, because it's only through the behavior that you generate the confirming evidence that says to you, hey, you know what? This diversity, this works. I love this. Look what we've done. And in that process of behaving and working and collaborating together, we generate the belief in the diversity, and we also generate the business impact. So we're generating two streams of evidence. Number one, the value of my diverse colleagues, which goes to a completely different level. And number two, the value of the business impact that we have created. So we've got to move beyond awareness and appreciation of differences. We've got to get to work. So we behave until we believe. That's not going to happen if we're sitting on the sidelines waiting for our hearts to change. It doesn't work that way. But if we get to work, we accelerate the process. It's absolutely fantastic. I personally, let me share something personal with you that you may appreciate. You'll notice in the book that I took some chances and I shared some personal experiences. So I'm much more autobiographical than I would normally be because I'm a trained researcher. So I should be this dispassionate third party that's just evaluating the data. You'll notice that I took some risks and I shared some personal experiences because I'm learning from my own personal experiences as well as analyzing the data. So I have personal qualitative data. I have personal anecdotal data. I have personal impressionistic data that I'm combining with the quantitative data. Let me give you an example. So in my career, I've had 2 African-American bosses. I've had a female boss. I've had a gay boss. I've had a Japanese boss. And I've had marvelous experiences with these people. Marvelous experiences. These people have been my mentors. I've had diverse experiences. I grew up in Durango, Colorado, and my father was a teacher among the Navajo, the second largest Native American tribe to the Cherokee. I've lived in Asia. I've lived in Europe. These are rich experiences. But the problem is that many people are having these experiences and they're not getting the yield. They're not learning from these experiences. They're not developing the inclusive DNA that we need to have. And so that's why I took some chances and I got a little more personal in the book. And I hope you'll forgive me for that, but I hope that it will resonate with you, because this is where we've got to get to in the 2020s. We've got work to do. Okay. Man, there's a lot of questions. Okay. Yes. Okay, let me give you a coaching tip, right? So I spend a portion of my time just with executives doing executive coaching. Let me give you a coaching tip. The primary purpose of coaching is to do two things. Number one, transfer accountability and ownership. And number two, transfer critical thinking. There needs to be a transfer of those two things, ownership and critical thinking. How do you do that? You cannot do that with a didactic model, a tell model. And so we do it with an inquiry model. We do it through questions. We lead primarily through questions rather than answers. So that means that we have to overcome the leader as oracle, industrial, imperial model of leadership. This is hard for people. It's hard for leaders. They have to unlearn this model. And so here's a very practical tip for you that are coaching. Learn to use what we call the 3 workhorse questions. Now, these are the 3 questions that transfer the burden of critical thinking. Number 1, what? Number 2, why? Number 3, how? If you ask those questions as you're coaching your people, you are transferring the primary burden of critical thinking. And so you need to use those questions a lot more and move away from the binary yes/no questions and the softballs. And then, of course, the didactic, the telling that just breeds dependency and learned helplessness. So create more rigor in your coaching conversations. Use the workhorse questions to transfer ownership and to transfer critical thinking. Does that make sense to you? The best coaches in the world, that's what they do. That's how you move people out of their comfort zone. You push them to the outer limits, not too far, but you put some stretch in there and you accelerate the development process. So use your workhorse questions. What? Why? How? Just a practical tip for those of you that are coaching. Okay, I think we've gone over enough. Jonathan, I'll turn it back over to you, my friend.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Tim. That was incredible talk that you just gave us, and extremely educational. This webinar is sponsored by the company Ntroduced.com. That's spelled like introduced without the I in front. And Ntroduced.com is a hiring platform that matches job seekers and companies together based on personality traits, cultural values, and soft skills. So what Dr. Clark is talking about here is directly relevant to what we do. And we feel that as a job hiring platform where job seekers and companies come together, I think it's extremely important to start hiring based on personality traits, cultural values, and soft skills that are needed to be able to put psychological safety in your workforce, in your team. So by hiring the right people, it'll be really helpful in achieving the psychological safety that Dr. Clark has been talking about. I want to thank everybody for attending. A lot of you have stayed on for the additional question answers, and we appreciate that. And Tim, I want to thank you for this webinar. It's been terrific. It's been very informative, and a lot of people are going to take away a lot of great things from it. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. We're going to wrap things up. Thanks, everybody.